Pretty much everyone knows you can go to Turkey to fix hair loss. But how many people know how hair loss actually happens? For hair loss sufferers, the truth is that most people never receive a clear explanation of what's actually happening in their scalp. And without that explanation, people are just willingly taking treatments without understanding the fundamentals of what they're trying to address. So wouldn't it be helpful to know why balding occurs biologically? In this video, I'm going to walk through the biology of hair loss, how a healthy hair follicle is built, how hair normally grows, and what actually changes when hair loss begins. Because once you understand the biology, the rest of the conversation around hair loss starts to make much more sense. As a doctor who has had my own hair loss journey, I found that most confusion stems from skipping this step. People jump straight into treatments without first understanding the system that those treatments are trying to influence. So let's start with that system itself. Every hair on your head grows from a tiny structure called a hair follicle, but it's important to realize something. A follicle isn't just a hole in the skin. It's actually a small biological organ. If you took a cross-section through the scalp, you would see a surprisingly complex structure extending deep into the skin. At the base of that structure is the hair bulb. This is where rapidly dividing cells generate their hair shaft, which is made of keratin, a fibrous protein. Inside the bulb sits one of the most important structures in hair biology, the dermal papilla. The dermal papilla contains specialized cells and blood vessels, and it acts as the follicle's control center. It sends signals that determine how fast the hair grows, how thick the hair becomes, and how long the follicle remains active. In many ways, the dermal papilla is like the brain of the follicle. If its signals change, the hair responds. Attached to the upper follicle are other supporting structures. The sebaceous gland, which produces sebum that lubricates the hair and scalp to prevent excessive dryness, the erector pili muscle, the tiny muscle responsible for goosebumps, which is a physiological response to trap air heat when we're cold. And there are also nerve fibers surrounding the hair bulb that detect the direction of hair movement. Interestingly, hair follicles also tend to exist in follicular units, so when you see a single pore on the scalp, there are often 2, 3, or even 4 hairs emerging from the same unit. The number, size, and orientation of these follicles all contribute to how dense hair appears. However, follicles don't produce hair continuously. Instead, they cycle through phases of activity and rest, and this is known as the hair cycle. The first phase is anagen, the growth phase. On the scalp, anagen can last anywhere from 2 to 7 years, and during this phase, the follicle is highly active. Cells divide rapidly and the hair shaft grows longer. In a healthy scalp, around 80 to 90% of follicles are in anagen at any given time. Next comes catagen, the transition phase, and this lasts only a few weeks. During catagen, the follicle begins to shrink, and the cell division stops. The dermal papilla moves upward inside of the follicle as the lower portion regresses. After catagen comes telogen, the resting phase. This lasts roughly 3 months, and during this time, the follicle pauses its activity while the existing hair remains in place. And finally comes exogen, the shedding phase. The old hair is released from the follicle and falls out, and a new hair begins growing from the same follicle. What's crucial here is that the follicles cycle independently of each other in a mosaic pattern, and they are not synchronized. This is why hair normally appears continuously full, because if all follicles shed at the same time, we would lose large amounts of hair in waves, but instead, the cycles are staggered, so the overall density remains stable. Hair loss usually becomes visible when something disturbs this balance, and that disturbance can happen in several ways. Sometimes the cycle becomes synchronized, leading to shedding all at once. But in the most common form of hair loss, something else happens. The most common cause of hair loss worldwide is androgenetic alopecia, often called male or female pattern hair loss. The defining biological feature of this condition is something called follicular miniaturisation. Miniaturisation means that the follicle gradually shrinks over successive cycles. Each new hair becomes slightly thinner, slightly shorter, and slightly less pigmented. But an important thing to understand is that this doesn't happen overnight. Hair loss is a slow biological process. A helpful way to picture this is to imagine a tree. If something eats away at the roots of that tree, the tree doesn't just suddenly fall. Instead, a new season produces slightly weaker growth. The branches become thinner, and the leaves become smaller, and hair follicles behave in a very similar way. Each hair cycle is like a new growing season, and in pattern hair loss, each cycle produces a slightly weaker hair. Over time, those hairs become so fine that the scalp begins to show through. One of the most interesting features of pattern hair loss is that it follows predictable patterns. In men, thinning often begins at the recession of the temples, with thinning at the crown or vertex. Over time, these areas may enlarge and eventually connect, leaving a horseshoe pattern of hair around the back and sides of the scalp. In women, the pattern is usually different. Most women retain their frontal hairline, but develop gradual thinning through the mid-scalp and the crown, and this often appears as a widening of the central part rather than any obvious bald patches. These patterns occur because different regions of the scalp respond differently to hormonal signals. Follicles in the frontal and crown regions tend to be more sensitive to androgen signaling, while follicles at the back of the scalp are relatively resistant. This resistance is also the reason why those follicles are used in hair transplant surgery. When they are moved to a thinning area, they often retain their original characteristics of resistance to androgens and thus miniaturization. So what actually drives this miniaturization process? One of the most important biological drivers in androgenetic alopecia is a hormone called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. DHT is produced when the enzyme 5-alpha reductase converts testosterone to dihydrotestosterone within the skin and hair follicle and other organs. At this point, though, it's important to understand something. DHT itself is not a harmful hormone. In fact, it plays an important role in normal human development. During puberty, DHT helps drive the development of facial hair, body hair, and other male characteristics. It is 5-alpha reductase and the formation of DHT that diverts the formation of female into male genitalia in the womb, if we have XY chromosomes. So this hormone is part of normal biology. The issue arises later in life in adulthood, when DHT's benefits start to diminish. In genetically susceptible hair follicles, DHT gradually alters the behavior of the dermal papilla. Over many hair cycles, this leads to shorter growth phases, progressive follicle shrinkage, and thinner hairs. Importantly, this process can occur in both men and women. The difference is mostly in the degree and the pattern, rather than the underlying mechanism itself. It's also worth remembering that not all hair loss happens through miniaturization. In some situations, the issue is not shrinking follicles, but rather cycle disruption. For example, after major illness, surgery, childbirth, or even severe metabolic stress like a crash diet, many follicles can shift into the resting or telogen phase at the same time. Therefore, several months later, those hairs shed together in exogen. This is called telogen effluvium. The follicle itself is still alive, but the timing has been reset where many follicles have their exogen coordinated. There are also conditions where the immune system interferes with the follicle directly. In alopecia areata, immune cells target the hair bulb during its growth phase. The follicle abruptly stops producing hair, resulting in discrete bald patches. There are also many other forms of hair loss separate to androgenetic alopecia, typically requiring a biopsy to diagnose, but that deserves its own video. The key idea to remember is this. Hair follicles are dynamic mini-organs with their own life cycles. Hair loss usually reflects a disruption of those cycles rather than an instant destruction of the follicle. And when we understand which biological process is involved, treatment strategies begin to make much more sense. If you'd like more calm, evidence-based explanations like this, consider subscribing to Hairline Helpline. In the next video, we'll take a closer look at one of the most important drivers of pattern hair loss, DHT, and why certain follicles are uniquely sensitive to it.